Well, I'll give you my all-time favorite quote. Okay.
What's that gone?
Which I will sometimes say that this was said by a great philosopher. It was actually said by Peter Sellers. And the line is, "There's a time to speak and a time to be silent, and this is not one of them."
Lovely. Well, my favourite Peter Sellers quote, he said, if I lived my life over again, he said, I'd do everything exactly the same, but I wouldn't read the Magus. Right. Okay. You there?
We're on.
Gary, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your background is?
Sure. I'm Gary Schwartz, and I'm presently a professor of psychology, medicine, neurology, psychiatry, and surgery at the University of Arizona. I direct what's called the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health, and also the Center for Frontier Medicine in Biofield Science. And the work that I do integrates essentially mind, body, and spirit.
Okay, when did you first become interested in working with mediums like Christopher and Alison?
It actually began, I first became interested in working with psychics and mediums like Christopher and John and Alison in the mid-1990s, when I was actually approached by a couple of people who were actually grieving the loss of loved ones, and they wanted to know if it was possible to prove whether their deceased loved ones were still here. And that's what actually started me on the journey.
Okay, tell us a little bit about the work that you do with John Edward and Alison Dubois and Susie Smith, and in a sense, what we're trying to get is how you feel they differ as mediums and psychics from Christopher.
Much of the work that I've done with mediums, such as John Edward and Alison Dubois and Susie Smith, has been investigating the extent to which these individuals and others like them can obtain accurate information about people who have died, and where the explanations cannot be due to what's called fraud or cold reading or rater bias or expectation, or even experimenter bias and expectation. In other words, you want to rule out all these conventional explanations of where this information comes from. And if under those controlled conditions a person can still obtain accurate information of a deceased loved one's specific information, then you have to rule in some sort of paranormal explanation, including survival of consciousness after death. Now, how these individuals differ from someone like Christopher Robinson is that, first of all, these people are doing this in a waking state, whereas Christopher receives much of his information in dreams. Secondly, the information that mediums typically receive are about deceased loved ones, what happened in the past and maybe what's happening in the present. Whereas Christopher and others like him are dreaming about future events, events that have not yet happened.
Okay, now moving on to Christopher, I gather he rang you, and that's how you first got to meet him. Tell us about those first conversations.
Well, I had never heard of Christopher Robinson, or even someone like Christopher Robinson. And I'll never forget the day I received a phone call in, I think it was early April 2001, from England, from this gentleman with a lovely British accent, claiming to have extraordinary abilities, claiming that he had was able to see this future in his dreams, claiming that he had been assisting in terrorist activity and also in other criminal investigations, claiming that this ability had occurred following a near-death experience that he had, and so on, and also claiming that not only had he written a book about some of his experiences, but also he was desperately interested in being able to document scientifically that what he did was real.
Okay, so how did you, as it were, formulate the format of the experiments? Was that you, or was it combined?
I should first say that just because Christopher called me and said that he wanted to do this research, I mean, I received a lot of strange phone calls, and it took a few phone calls, plus my reading his book, and doing some pilot type experiments, for me to come to the conclusion that Christopher seemed genuine. And not only that, he was willing to come to the University of Arizona. He was willing to fly across the country on his own expense, stay in a hotel at his own expense, because I didn't have any money for this kind of work, in order to show to me and the rest of the world that what he did was real. And he was also willing to do this under controlled scientific conditions. And so because of that, and because of his sincerity, I felt that Christopher deserved the opportunity to show what he could do. Now, this experiment was designed primarily by Christopher and secondarily by me. Now, what I mean by that is that if you're going to test someone who claims to do extraordinary things, it's essential that you design the experiment to be as close as possible to what they actually do. And if you don't design an experiment around their actual skills, you can end up asking people to do things that they actually can't do or don't really represent what they do. So what I did was I asked Christopher to explain to me what are the different kinds of experiences that he had, what did he think that he could do, and then as we discussed this, he and I designed an experiment that would, if it came out positive, and I mean really positive, would therefore lead us to the strong conclusion that there was something very real here. We were not trying to design the perfect experiment. We were trying to design an experiment where, if it worked, it would be sufficiently convincing to then do subsequent research.
Okay, now I'm aware that in the format of the experiment you were very keen to rule out things like telepathy and so on and so forth. So perhaps you can tell a little bit about, because it was rather strange the whole way it worked with the envelopes and Bill Simon and Bill Simon's wife. You know, that seems to be a strange template. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes. The basic design of the experiment was that Christopher was going to dream about going to 10 different places, 10 consecutive days. And I was to pick, a few weeks before the actual experiment, what these 10 places would be. And only I would know what they were. Now what I did was I actually picked 20 places and then put them in envelopes, sealed the envelopes, and then shuffled the envelopes. So that even though we were only going to be going to 10 of them, what this meant was that even after we'd gone to the first 9, there were still 11 possible other places that we might go. And so therefore there was no way that I could know where we were going ahead of time. So this is ruling out me possibly knowing where we were going to be going. Then, to make sure that there was no way that there could be any, quote, fraud involved, what I did was I then sent the envelopes to my writing partner, William Simon, who also, by the way, belongs to the Magic Castle. He's a professional magician. He knows about fraud and so on, because we wanted to rule out any possibility of fraud. And then what he did was he gave the envelopes to a third person who I did not know the identity of this person. Of course, either did Christopher. What this person did was then shuffled these 20 envelopes. Remember, they were sealed. And then numbered them from 1 to 20. Envelopes 1 through 10 became the 10 places we would go. Envelopes 11 through 20 became the controls. And so therefore, what would happen is on a given night, Christopher would go to sleep, ask the universe where was he going to be taken on the next day. The next morning, he would then go through and read the material that he received in his dream, plus previous dreams when he had been in England. He would then determine what the themes, what the primary major points were. And only after that information had been recorded and videotaped did I then call Bill Simon, who then contacted the third person, and then this person opened the envelope for that day, informed Bill Simon who it was, Bill then informed me, and it was only at that point that I then knew where we were going.
Now, like all experiments, with hindsight, is there anything you think you would have done differently if you did it again now?
There are things that I wish we could have done that were just not feasible. So for example, it would have been nice if we could have afforded it to have someone else who was going along, who was videotaping everything, who didn't know anything about the sites, was kept blind to the information, was collecting all this information just without having our knowledge ahead of time, and then later taking all that information and having it systematically scored blindly. That would have been, quote, the ideal thing to do. The problem was that we didn't have the finances to be able to hire someone to be able to be in that role and also so to keep them secret. So what we had to do was, we knew what we were looking for. We were looking for details that were reflecting that information. And what was critical in order for the experiment to work was that Christopher had to get specific information that would be unique to the settings, that would not be repeated in subsequent days, and that would identify events not only at the site, but were also happening on the way to the site, some of which were, if you would, structural in the site, but some of them were unique events that were happening at the moment that the action was taking place. And it was the combination of that information that ultimately led to the conclusion that this was a real phenomenon.
Now, if you could take us through the days, briefly, if you like, one by one, and also kind of give us a feeling of what you felt at the time. I mean, we have it on videotape that you seemed fairly kind of astounded at the results.
Yes, I allowed myself to be completely me as the experiment was going on. I was not dressed in a jacket. I was not trying to be professorial. I was just a person on an adventure and finding the totality of what was happening continually surprising. And what was interesting was that actually the days started, so to speak, gently, and with each consecutive day more surprises and more details would come up. It was almost as if there was some intelligence to this whole process, they were gently taking me along, because I could only handle so much surprise per day. For example, on day one, I remember that Christopher just got a few pieces of information. He saw holes, lots and lots of holes. There was a theme of holes and holes. There was also a theme of basin, and there was a theme of water, and no water in this basin. And when I heard that information, I didn't know what he was talking about. To me, that meant nothing. We ended up going to the Desert Museum. I subsequently learned that when you drive into the Desert Museum and you go over the top of the mountains, you literally enter a huge basin, which was once filled with water. It's literally called a basin, which is now empty. And when we got to the Desert Museum, there were holes everywhere. There were holes in the ground of going into caves. The animals were kept in holes. One of my favorite, and many people's favorite demonstrations there and sites are all of these prairie dogs that are living in holes. And you're going to find holes in lots of places. But this place had hole after hole after hole. And if he was going to pick a single place for the theme of holes to be presented, of all the places, there were more holes there than were in any of the other 9 places. I didn't consider that, by the way, a great hit, but it was certainly consistent. So it was, in fact, I rated it on a scale from 0 to 10 as a 9-something. It was very good, but it could have been just chance. But as we went day after day, the details became ever more specific. And then he started getting more information, and the information was not only related to things that were present, but also events that were happening literally on the way to the site or at the site, and then subsequently were also happening after the day was officially over, but in terms of the experiment, but not in terms of the events that we could subsequently verify. Because Christopher, by the way, said that he wasn't able to constrain the dreams at this point. He said that the information was going to be more or less getting information that was within 14 or 16 hours of the day's events.
Okay, of the days, I mean, you mentioned this to us earlier. Which do you think were the most impressive?
Well, there are days that were the most impressive, and then there were days that were transformative for me. And the 2 most transformative days were days 5 and then days 10. And let's take day 5. On day 5, Christopher received information about a border and that there were policemen at this border, and there was some sort of a water tank or something around this border. He was seeing boats, lots of boats. He saw a car with 4 flat tires, and this car had no oil, and he wrote in the text mineral oil. What that mean? He also saw something about the car that was reminded him of the London Embassy. He also saw tires along a chain link fence. He saw umbrellas, lots of umbrellas. He saw something to do with the Spirit of God, and also something about me needing a credit card in order to get into the building. Well, when I looked at this collection of material, the only thing I can imagine that we would go to that would fit this was going to be Nogales, which is a border town, and was one of the 20 possible sites. Well, after we get this information, I call Bill Simon, third person opens the envelope, and I'm told that where we're going is to the Gem and Mineral Store. And I said, yes, Christopher's finally wrong. The first 4 days he was getting better and better information, but he's finally wrong. At this point I'm rooting for him to be wrong because it's been too accurate. Well, of course I don't tell him where we're going, and he's packed up our cameras. I don't tell Bill what the information is, and then we start going down the street, going the only way I know how to get to this Gem and Mineral Store. And about a mile from the Gem and Mineral Store, Christopher says, "Are we near the border?" I said, "No, Christopher, I'm sorry, we're not." He said, "But my dreams are very clear. There's something about a border." I said, "Christopher, I'm sorry, there's no border here. The border's at least 40 or 50 miles. Well, he was confused. A little bit further down, we see some policemen off the side of the road. Now, Christopher saw a policeman all across the side of the road. But by the way, there are lots of policemen in these crossings in lots of places. Well, we turn off the side of the road just to look at the policemen. Sure enough, they're doing construction. And behind the construction is a water tank. And what it says on the water tank, I'll never forget this, was borderland. So now we got borderland, we got a water tank, we've got policemen. I said, that's interesting. We then go a little bit further along, and a person trailering a boat passes us. We then pass a boat storage yard. Now remember, we're in the desert. What are all these boats around here? We make a right-hand turn to go up the street to the Gem and Mineral Store, and there is a stand. I can't remember whether there were 4 canoes or 8 canoes. There's some of these boats lined up. I said, boy, that's a lot of boats. Well, we drive up to the Gem and Mineral Store. Remember, Chris did not say Gem and Mineral Store. And to the right of the Gem and Mineral Store is a car with 4 flat tires. Now, how often do you bump into a car that has 4 flat tires? Well, Christopher is really excited. He goes, right, it's just like I saw in my dreams, he said. He said, in my dreams I could walk right up to the tires and touch the tires. So, of course, what did I do? I went out and actually took some photographs of him. This car did not have any oil. It did not have any, quote, mineral oil. It's in front of a mineral store, Gem and Mineral Store. And you know what kind of car it was? It was a Rambler Ambassador, London Embassy Ambassador. I go into the Gem and Mineral Store, and I asked him, I said, excuse me, I said, how long has this car been out here? He says, oh, it's been there over 20 years. Now, I didn't need a credit card to get into the store. There were no tires with chain link fence, right? There were no umbrellas that I could see. I didn't see anything with the Spirit of God. Well, we go back to the hotel. We made a list of what we saw. We made a list of what wasn't there. And the experiment is now over. At which point I began to discover I'm running out of digital videotape. And so was Christopher. I said, Christopher, on the way to the lab, would you mind if we stopped at a store that we can get a lot of this inexpensively? So he said, no problem. So I took him to a large, sort of a warehouse store called Costco's. We go to the store, and you need to use your Costco card to get into the store. Christopher said, see, I told you were going to be using a credit card. Now at this point I'm thinking to myself, well, his suggested credit card was probably just unconscious. Well, we go in, we look for the tapes. That's not important to the story right now. At which point Christopher says, I'm hungry. And I said, Christopher, but I have to get back to the lab. He said, but Gary, I'm really hungry. I said, well, the only place we have time to eat is if you don't mind eating right here. in this large supply store. So I order him a sandwich. We sit down, and he says, "Look over there," and over there is this chain link fence with all these tires piled up, drawn virtually like he had in his diagram. And then he says, he looks all around, and he says, "Gary," he says, "look at this." And there are umbrellas. Now we're talking about a lot of umbrellas. There have to be at least 10 umbrellas in there. Huge beach umbrellas, okay? On these beach umbrellas, you have to understand, there's no sun. This is inside, but there's the umbrellas. And then I look at what I see on these umbrellas is writing. There's advertising. And I will never forget this for as long as I live, which may be a very long time, particularly if life after death is real. And what it says it was an advertisement for Hebrew National Hot Dogs. And the advertisement was, "We answer to a higher authority." In the Spirit of God, question mark? So, what I mean by transformative was not that I necessarily believed what Christopher was saying was true, and not that I was going to start looking for alternative explanations, but rather that I realized that what was happening was much greater and much deeper than anything that I could have imagined was possibly occurring. And therefore, I had to take very seriously the possibility that if this continued, we were going to be making a discovery that would certainly lead me to have to reevaluate the way in which I had been trained to look at reality.
Okay, now that's a major statement. So does that mean, I mean, I'm jumping ahead rather, but I'm
Sure.
just picking up on what you've said there. Does that mean you now believe in precognitive dreams?
I think when you look at the totality of what happens in the 10-day experiment, plus what has continued to happen in another experiment that I did with Christopher, plus as I've continued to watch Christopher doing other things which I know are genuine, plus having met other individuals who are in their own way are able to do things similar to, not as great as what Christopher does, but similar to. When I look at the totality of all that evidence, yes, I have come to the conclusion that this is a very real phenomenon and that we have to take it very seriously.
Okay, just going back now to the days one by one, if you like. As I explained to you, we've actually gone back and recreated the what's it called, Kip Peak. Can you tell us about that day in specific? Because I've seen the tapes, and you were very excited by that.
Yes, Kip Peak, was that day 4?
Day 4 was day 4.
Yes, the Kip Peak day was a very special day because Christopher saw many details that were very precise. For example, he saw a solar telescope. He actually constructed something that related to a sun and a telescope. And by the way, how many solar telescopes are there anywhere? And here we were, it turned out, when I actually made the phone call and discovered where we were going. We're going to Kip Peak, which has the world's largest solar telescope. I was also struck by the fact that he got information that was somewhat symbolic. For example, so he saw information about his camera, but he knew from the context of the camera to be able to interpret that concrete image into a symbol, because that's part of what makes him the dream detective, is he knows how to take certain information and he knows how to figure out when is it literal and when is it symbolic. And so I watched him do that. So those details were very dramatic, and it was very excited to be driving up to the top of this mountain and realizing that he got all these details. It was right. But what I found even more amazing were the things that didn't make any sense. For example, he had this thing about this propeller and this airfield and planes and stuff, and I didn't know what he was talking about. What does that have to do with Kip Peak Observatory? But driving back, we ended up passing this restaurant, and this restaurant turns out to have a little private airfield, and in front of this restaurant is this gigantic propeller. And so there again I was seeing that although the site was the telescopes, he was getting additional information that we could independently verify. How many restaurants do you know of that have a gigantic propeller in front of them, that are alongside an airport, again, the constellation or the pattern for me was very telling.
I mean, there were other events on other days. We talked about the day when you were in Tucson, and there was, if you like, extraneous information there that wasn't to do with the experiment specifically. It was when he had a feeling about the murder of the woman. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Here we are walking down the street. Christopher said he saw parking meters. Well, there are various streets that have parking meters. He said that there were these huge, tall satellite dishes, lots of tall satellite dishes. What was amusing that here we are going down the street, which is downtown Tucson, which has parking meters, which by the way was the only of the 10 days that had parking meters. We walked down the street, and to the right is a gigantic collection of satellite dishes. So it's not just a satellite, not just 2 or 3, but many of them. And as we're walking along, Christopher says, we need to get out of here. And I said, why? He said, well, because there's going to be a murder somewhere around here. And I said, Christopher, I said, if there's a murder around here, shouldn't we, for example, look and see whether it's in the newspaper today? He said, Gary, he said, my dreams were very clear. The murder was going to happen later. It was going to be appearing in tomorrow's newspaper. We ended up leaving the area. Sure enough, tomorrow, the next day, just as Christopher predicted, on the front page, which was the only day that there was a murder in Tucson, an elderly woman not far from where we were had been shot like he predicted.
Do you have a copy of that paper, by the way, still?
Yeah, actually, I probably have it home.
Okay, well, so we should get that, and also the microfiche we want to go
If I could find it. Yeah.
Okay. The other day that you said, speaking to you this morning, that you found extraordinary was a day when, in actual fact, you had half a day, and Christopher predicted that he would end up sunning by the pool, and that came to pass.
It began to dawn on me on day 9 that if there was some sort of intelligent process at work here, that we would be able to test this, because something was happening on day 10 that I hadn't told Christopher. And of course, I didn't know it until all of this got scheduled. And that was that I had to be speaking at the medical school at a conference in the early afternoon. And many of these days took us way beyond, certainly into the mid-afternoon. And some of the sites, for example, if we had gone to Mexico or if we had gone to the top of Mount Lemmon or whatever, we would have been gone, and therefore I couldn't attend the meeting. So I said, look, Christopher, I said, if you're right, that there's some sort of intelligence coordinating all of this, then this is going to have to be really close to the hotel. And it's going to have to end very quickly. I said, otherwise you'll have to go with Bill Simon, because he now flew out. He actually wanted to see what was going on. And I said, if this is not being coordinated, we'll know it's not being coordinated because then I'm not going to be able to be present. At which point Christopher drops the bombshell. He said, Gary, he said, my dreams are very clear. He said, in June I dreamt that on the last day we would be finishing very early. I would be spending the day by the pool. And I said, what, Christopher? You dreamt in June before I even thought of where we were going to possibly be going. I didn't pick the sites until the end of July, but he's dreaming in June about where we're going to be going in August, and is being told that on the last day it's going to end quickly. Well, in the information he gets an ROTC kind of building. He sees large trees, he sees green grass, he sees water, some sort of going over a brook. The only place that I could imagine that fit this description was the top of Mount Lemmon. Mount Lemmon was very far away. There was no way that I could go. That meant that he was wrong. This was not coordinated. I would not be part of the process. The envelope was opened, and where are we going? We're going to the Arizona State Museum, which is maybe 6 blocks from the hotel. I said, wow, that's really close. However, the information I thought was wrong. But nonetheless, we drive along. We take the south road because the west part was closed because they were doing construction. We walk along the only way I know, the back way to get around there, and we start seeing these tall trees. I mean, really large trees in this area. And we don't have a lot of large trees in Tucson. We have some. And so I said, Christopher, I said, are these your trees? He said, no. He said, my dream was very clear. He said, it looked like a London park. I said, fine. One of the things, by the way, that's very good about Christopher is he doesn't just own data. The data has to fit and fit what he thinks it fits, otherwise he doesn't accept it, which means he's very discerning. We finally enter this area where there's grass and there's these big trees. It turns out to be on Park Avenue. And Christopher says, "Ah, this is like my London park." Now I'm scratching my head. We now walk over to the area where the Arizona State Museum is, and they were doing construction and they're cleaning down the streets and the water is running along. We have to step over a brook, water, to get there. I said, gee, this is interesting. We walk up to the museum and it's closed. It's closed. The day is over. There's nothing to see on the inside. We've been out 20, 25 minutes. Now I'm really shocked. Because not only is the information accurate, he's going to be by that pool. And as we're walking back, I'm scratching my head. I'm sort of in a daze. And then he says, look. And over there is the University ROTC building, Army Navy building. And it was at this point I said, I give up. There's too much going on in this experiment. And we must preserve it. We must somehow describe it and someday, hopefully, show it to the world. The Twin Tower experience was actually very disturbing for me because about 2/3 of the way through the experiment, Christopher relayed that he had a nightmare. He used the term nightmare. And he told me and he told a number of other people in the bar at the hotel that in his dream, it was this big city and he saw these planes crashing into this tall building, and thousands of people were dying. Now, I could not imagine this. Remember, this is in early August. I said, Christopher, I said, do you have any sense about when this is going to happen? He said, no. I said, do you know exactly where it's going to happen? He said, no. And he asked me, he said, is this part of the experiment? I said, no. And so what I did was I dismissed it. I couldn't even imagine that this was a possibility. And I let it go. I didn't think about it for the rest of the time he was there. But when he went back to England, he continued to have dreams about this. And then in early September, he called me, and he told me that these dreams were continuing. And of course, one thing led to another, and he ultimately, finally, a few days before, actually sent a CD of the 10-day in Arizona experiment to the, I think it was the American Embassy, trying to get their attention that something was imminent was happening. And then on the day of 9/11, of course, the impossible happened. And all of a sudden, I realized what Christopher must be living with. Imagine if you could be having dreams about something absolutely horrific happening, and you knew that if you could just get the information to the right people, it might be prevented. And here you are, even flying from England to the southwest of the United States to trying to get a scientist to look at what you're doing with an open but careful mind, and still you can't get the information communicated in a way that it might save lives.
I mean, that takes us on, I think, to something which we've been talking about with Christopher, that a couple of things you touched on there, what it must be like to have this kind of gift, and also the nature of Christopher himself, because obviously, you know, I've said it to his face, he's absolutely, well, he's not exactly the archetypal sort of person you'd expect. You know, one associates psychics with some kind of cerebral kind of sensitivity, and Christopher's a normal guy. How do you think those two things live together, and do you think the very fact that Christopher is so grounded helps him, you know, in a sense, carry the burden of this gift?
Yes. Christopher has a strong analytic side. For example, he worked at the time as a TV repairman. And Christopher's analytic mind led him to be really an explorer, and I would say scientist, in trying to discover what kinds of information was accurate, what kinds of information was inaccurate, what kinds of symbols predicted what kinds of events. So he was constantly learning and constantly criticizing. Also because he ended up using information that would be bringing criminals to justice, including, for example, corrupt policemen. It was very important to know what evidence is and to be able to justify evidence. And I think that logical and sort of being a father and having children and being a husband and working conventional jobs, all of that led him to have the right combination of motivation and analysis plus openness.